It is known that Mr. Jones has the best garden in Fox Hollow. Indeed, the reputation of his green thumb is so well recognized that some claim he has the best greenery in North America, if not the world, though Mr. Jones would disagree with such a bold statement. Glowing praise aside, it's true that he has grown the finest plants for 100 miles around. His irises are large and splendid. His chrysanthemums, like his carnations, are a feast of colours that dazzle the eyes, and his daffodils could make angels weep with their divine beauty. Nothing in his exquisite leafy domain compares to the perfectly formed and heavenly, one could almost say otherworldly scent of his roses. His roses came to public notice a year after he had moved into his current abode. So glorious was the apparent overnight arrival of his Rosica that the entire neighbourhood came to a standstill as families, friends, and garbage men alike stood bewildered and in awe of his illustrious herbage. Of course, this wondrous display of natural brilliance had everyone for miles around begging and pleading and even attempting to bribe Mr. Jones for a hint of knowledge, a line of understanding, or a mere whisper as to how he had achieved such resplendence. Mr. Jones simply smiled and told them that it was achieved through a perfect soil, though he pronounced it as soul. And a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, nothing more. After receiving the same vague answer time after time, the townspeople finally stopped asking him questions and just embraced his talent and wondrous bounty. Then, one evening during a particularly bad winter, Mr. Jones returned home from his uninteresting and nondescript job to discover that a number of his roses had begun to wilt. This discovery shocked him to the core. How had he failed them? What had he done or not done to bring about this disaster? He quickly gathered the fallen petals and drooping leaves and rushed them into his house. In his haste, he left the car door open and the front door unlocked. He didn't even bother turning on the lights. He kicked open the basement door, charged down the flight of stairs, and stormed across the cold concrete floor towards the sanguinancy altar. Over the next half hour, with dim moonlight trickling in the basement window, Mr. Jones, with his hands shaking and sickly sweat dripping down his forehead, prepared for the blood ritual. With delicacy and careful consideration, he placed the petals and leaves into a bowl which sat in the centre of a circled dot within an 11th star. He rummaged through the notebooks and papers which sat on the shelf to the right of the altar, and withdrew his journal of Caliginous Sacrament. He opened to the appropriate pages. He then took an obsidian sickle from the shelf which stood on the left, and placed it atop the pages. With everything ready, he wiped the sweat from his brow, and turned from the altar, wandering back upstairs. Mr. Jones knew that many of his peers believed that ceremony and magic should be a pure mixture of traditional arts, and one should never incorporate anything contemporary or futuristic. He disagreed with this backwards belief, however, choosing to embrace both traditional and modern methods. So he returned to the house proper, locked the car, bolted the door, and drew all the curtains. With that done, and in complete darkness, he turned on his computer. He sat in front of the screen for approximately an hour and searched for the latest countrywide birth records. He jotted several down and searched for information regarding their families. After a time, David Heap, 3 days old, the first child of a young Virginia couple, became the point of bloody interest. Mr. Jones printed off all the facts regarding the boy and returned to the basement. Once there, he placed the documents on the altar, removed a candle from the shelf on the left, lit it, and placed it before the bowl. He then rolled up his shirt sleeve and raised the sickle high. In a single swift action, he sliced through his left bicep, allowing the blood to run down his arm and drip off of his fingers into the bowl of leafy debris. He then smeared the blood from the sickle onto the printed pages. With a little effort he crumpled them into the shape of a rose and put them in the bowl. He placed the burning candle into the bowl and let the resulting flames go about their work. He then fell to his knees, his journal lying open before him, and read the incantation. Blood from a loyal servant and the spirit of a newborn babe, I kneel before you begging to return my dead to life again. Mr. Jones spent the rest of the night in that position, repeating the incantation, hoping, praying that his sacrifice of loyal blood and a fresh soul would embolden those that dwell at the edge of the dream, between the cracks in time, in the now and then and ever after, to look down upon him once more and find his subservience worthy of their ears, his blood palatable for their tastes, and the fresh soul sweeter than the finest ambrosia. The next morning, Mr. Jones awoke on the basement floor. Blood stained his flesh and clothes, foul-smelling sweat covered his body, unpleasant liquid covered the floor, altar, walls, and more. With difficulty he clambered to his feet and staggered upstairs. He pulled on an old overcoat and wandered into the garden. His heart began to race. Snowy footfalls thundered inside his head as he drew near his beloved flowers. He fell to his knees, and icy tears dripped down his cheeks as his eyes fell upon the fresh growth and renewed blossoms that were finer than ever before. He smiled and wept. They had accepted his gift, as they always had done. Within a week, the parents of David Heap buried the cold slug of rotting flesh that had been their child. The doctors didn't have any clue as to how he had died. They thought cot death or some unknown disease, but were not convinced of it. Not that it mattered to the broken parents, whose hearts would always be empty until the day they died. A few months later, as the summer sun was beating down upon them, the neighbours of Mr. Jones once again asked the secret of his ever-improving garden, and once again he smiled and simply said that it was achieved through a perfect soul.